Welcome everybody to the second day of Southeast Kansas Pride. Thank you for joining us for our second Lunch and Learn workshop. Today we have a wonderful presentation, but before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to give you an overview of what's coming up the rest of the week. Tonight we have a mental health first aid workshop at 7 o'clock. Then on Thursday we have our LGBTQ history workshop at noon. And then that evening, we have a panel of activists led by author CJ Genovi at 7 p.m. And then on Friday, join us for our intersectionality workshop at noon, followed by that evening, our Project Q&A Hangout. You can register for the Hangout on our Facebook event page and join us, learn about what's going on with Project Q&A, and then connect with others in the area. And then our main event is on Saturday at 6:30 p.m. So log on to Facebook. Also head over to our website and download a bingo card to play along with our main event. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for this afternoon's presentation. Dr. Jake Newsome is a museum educator and scholar of German and American LGBTQ history. He earned his PhD from the University at Buffalo, and his research focuses on Holocaust history, gender and sexuality, and memory studies. His current book project, Pink Triangle Legacies, Holocaust Memory and Modern Gay Identity, explores the fate of gay and lesbian Holocaust victims and the ways in which memories of their persecution shaped gay rights activism and identity. Dr. Newsome is the manager of civil learning for campus communities at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. His work aims to empower college students across the nation with the knowledge, motivation, and skills necessary to apply the lessons of the Holocaust in their lives today by cultivating communities in which hate cannot flourish. Welcome, Dr. Newsome.
All right, well, thanks, Brandon. Thanks for that. And good afternoon, everybody. First, I just want to express my gratitude to Brandon and Project Q&A for the invitation to be here today. As someone who grew up gay in a small rural southern town, I really appreciate the work that Project Q&A does in bringing education and resources and representation to rural queer communities. So it is an honor to speak with all of you today as part of your Pride lineup. Each year when LGBTQ communities celebrate Pride Month, they mark the anniversary of when a group of trans women of color, lesbians, gay men, drag queens, and other queer people at New York City Stonewall Inn rioted against police brutality in 1969. And really these annual Pride celebrations offer us the opportunity to acknowledge the contributions and the accomplishments of the LGBTQ community, but they also prompt us to reflect on the historical tragedies that they've endured. And a lot of times, right, this queer history has been purposefully excluded from mainstream history books. And it's, usually actually up to queer people themselves to end up researching and telling these stories. And one of these hidden histories is the fate of the LGBTQ community during the Holocaust. And that's what I'm going to be speaking about with you today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So we should be good to go. You would think after these many months of remote working, I would be really used to doing that by now. But increasingly, more and more people that I speak with or that I work with at least know, right, that there were gay victims of the Nazi regime. And that's a good thing, right? We want more people to be educated about it. But it seems when I talk to folks, most people think that Hitler simply, targeted anyone who was different. And while that's technically true, I feel like it's not necessarily specific enough to be helpful. The Nazis did target many different groups during their 12-year rule, but that doesn't mean that all victims were treated equally or targeted for the same reason. In fact, the Nazi leadership had very specific reasons why they targeted each group. The Nazis, and really unfortunately, much of the German population at the time felt that some groups like Jews, Roma, and people with disabilities were tainted down to their blood. Right? They believed that the problem with these groups of folks was racial, and therefore it could not be cured. So the Nazis' policies then were to remove these groups from German society, from German land, and ultimately from life itself. Now, other groups, like political opponents and Jehovah's Witnesses, were persecuted because of their actions or beliefs. They were treated horribly. They were rounded up in concentration camps. They were tortured, starved, and even killed. But they were not targeted in the same way for genocide, because ultimately the Nazis believed that these groups could be kind of retrained and then reintegrated back into German society. So the people we're going to talk about today, right, folks that we would today call members of the LGBTQ community, they were somewhere in the middle of these groups. So by studying how the Nazis understood sexuality, and really homosexuality in particular, it teaches us a lot about how the Nazis viewed the world. And it also can give us I think, a fuller and more nuanced understanding of the Holocaust itself. So I want to start this afternoon with a story of a man named Richard Bruno. You can see here on your screen. Richard enjoyed a relatively comfortable childhood in northern Germany. He was born in the fall of 1903. He was one of 8 children who lived in their family home in Flensburg, which was a small coastal city nestled along the German-Danish border. As a young man, Richard studied art, and he traveled widely throughout Germany and Europe. And in February of 1933, he decided to move to Berlin to study art at the famous Bauhaus Institute. But this famous art school was not the only thing that drew him to Berlin. After the defeat of the German Empire in World War I, Germany established the Weimar Republic, which was the country's first democracy. And in the 1920s and early 1930s, Berlin became really a gay capital of the world. So people came from New York, they came from London, they came from Paris, they came from all over to immerse themselves and enjoy a really unprecedented LGBTQ culture there in Germany's capital city. Now, although it wasn't a full acceptance, right? Everyone wasn't treated completely equally. It certainly was an unprecedented level of tolerance that wasn't seen anywhere else in the world. So in Berlin alone, so in this one city, there were over 100 bars, clubs, and cafes that catered either exclusively to a queer clientele, or at least let it be known that it was a safe space for this community. The one that you can see here on the screen is called the El Dorado. It was the most famous. It was the biggest bar, queer bar in Berlin. And in fact, it became such a hotspot that even straight people came to the El Dorado. It became just really a central part of Berlin nightlife, and essentially anyone who was anybody went to the El Dorado. But it wasn't just about having a good time. The gay community also published a number of newspapers and magazines. Whether you were interested in culture and politics and art, you could find one for you. And in fact, to give you a sense of the scale of this community, the most recent research shows that the readership of these queer magazines and newspapers in Germany at this time was well over 1 million people. Now, just because ideas around a more acceptance or a more accepting atmosphere of queer culture, just because those ideas change, it doesn't mean that the laws change. So Germany had on the books, since its founding, an anti-gay law called Paragraph 175, and you can see the text of it here on your screen. And I just want to point out that when Germany was founded as a country in 1871, this was one of the very original laws that were on the books at that time. So you can see here, right, it says unnatural and indecent acts among men. And I just want to point out that the use of the word men here is not kind of the generic mankind men. They're really specifically focusing on males, on men. And so the law did not mention or relate to women, so lesbians, bisexual people or trans people. And we'll discuss the Nazis' view on lesbians in a moment. But I do just want to take a moment to talk about at least the legal situation for people we would today call trans individuals. The Germans, again, even before the Nazis came to power, had a law against cross-dressing. It was called Paragraph 183, and they used this law, of course, to target trans people. Now, the identity and the word that was used at the time was transvestite, and that included, different types of identities and self-identification that included, identities that we would today, that would closely align to the trans identity today. But it also included, like people like drag performers. And so this paragraph 183 was used to arrest, all of these different groups of people that kind of fell under that umbrella of what the Germans called cross-dressing. Some trans people, especially trans women, were arrested as gay men under paragraph 175. And so it's a little difficult to try to figure out the exact numbers of how many trans people were arrested or persecuted during the Holocaust because of the fluid nature of the terminology used at the time. Now, of course, not everyone in Germany agreed with the progress that was made under the Weimar Republic. And as you can imagine, there was always conservative pushback. So the National Socialist German Workers' Party, so it was the NSDAP, or the Nazi Party, were gaining power by the end, gaining followers rather, by the end of the 1920s and early 1930s. And they are very clearly an anti-gay party, but being anti-gay was never as central to Nazi ideology as anti-Semitism was, for example. But they didn't make their anti-gay stance a secret. They let it be known. And in fact, by 1928, there was a push in the German parliament to repeal paragraph 175. And the Nazis, let it be known that they will fight it tooth and nail because they say that if homosexuality is allowed to go unchecked, it would lead to the downfall of the nation. Now, in 1932, the Nazi party they become a majority party in the German parliament, and Hitler is appointed chancellor in January of 1933. Now, part of the Nazis' campaign, right, is that they are going to be the party that's going to clean up Germany. They're going to reinstate law and order. They're going to clean up the so-called moral decay that was ushered in by the Weimar Republic. So this, of course, included the fact that they said they wanted to go after homosexuality, who they saw as weak men or masculine women. Interracial marriages was also one of the things that they wanted to put an end to. Now, before we go any further, I think that there's always two kind of fundamental things that we have to understand before we can really understand how the Nazis treated the queer community during the Holocaust. And the first is that the Nazis did not believe that gay people or queer people existed, at least not as a separate group of people that was somehow biologically different than straight people. So therefore, they didn't believe in a gay identity. They thought that homosexuality was a set of behaviors, right? They believed it was a vice, like gambling. They believed that anyone could fall victim to being gay. In fact, that's one of the reasons they thought it was so dangerous, is that it could ultimately affect anyone living in Germany at the time. Now, the Nazis weren't unique in this regard. Actually, this was a predominant ideology across the Western world at the time. Some scientists, like Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, were studying homosexuality as a science, and they were advocating for rights on the basis that people were born gay, and therefore it was illegal or immoral, right, to punish these people for something they couldn't affect or couldn't change. But Hirschfeld was definitely in the minority at this time, and so really, if we're trying to think about this from the Nazis' perspective of why they're going after gay people, you have to think, it makes more sense to think about it as a campaign against homosexuality, right, as a noun, rather than going after all homosexual individuals, again, because they didn't believe that an individual was born different. And the second point that's really important in understanding this history is that the Nazis were not opposed to homosexuality for any moral or religious reasons. They viewed the threat of homosexuality as something that went much, much deeper, and they saw it as a racial threat to the German nation. So, and this is not just kind of some low-level Nazi bureaucrats who are thinking about this. Heinrich Himmler, right, who was the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, he knew that sex was never just sex, right? And he ridiculed those that claimed that what happened in the bedroom was a personal matter. So in 1937, he told a group of his lieutenants that all things which take place in the sexual sphere are not the private affair of the individual, but signify the life and death of the nation. So for the Nazis, right, if they wanted to create and reproduce a master race, it makes sense if you think about it, that first they had to understand and then control human sexuality, right? So for them, homosexuality robbed the master race of children, right? It robbed them of the next generation of offspring. And so they viewed it as a direct threat to the master race. In fact, it was so central to Nazi thinking about the future of the fatherland that here you can see in March of 1937, the Schwarze Kur, which was the official newspaper of the SS, ran a front page headline article that called homosexuals enemies of the state. So for Nazis then, combating homosexuality, again, wasn't just moral or religious, it was a matter of national security. Now, so once the Nazis get into power, the first thing that they want to do, the first action in their campaign against homosexuality is to shut down the public spaces, right? All of these cafes and bars and organizations, all the publications, they want to get it out of the public sphere. Again, this idea that if you remove the temptation, you remove it publicly, you're going to stop more people from kind of being tempted into this lifestyle. And so within weeks, they were able to destroy and drive back underground this really elaborate queer culture that Germans had built for themselves in the capital city of Berlin. So here you can see a picture of the El Dorado that we saw earlier. It's been shut down within a matter of 3 weeks. And here you can see it's been plastered with Hitler and Nazi campaign posters. Book burnings, right? Everyone, I think most people are familiar with the famous book burnings in May of 1933 in Berlin. What a lot of people don't know is that one of the major targets of this book burning was Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Sciences, in which he had collected a gigantic library and archive of queer literature and science. His institute was looted and all of its contents were burned and destroyed in the evening of May 6, 1933. So all in all, around 20,000 books and journals and around 5,000 images from this institute were destroyed in the fire that evening. Now, you'd think that inheriting a national anti-gay law would be an advantage for the Nazis, right? But since within a few years of paragraph 175's initiation in 1871, the German court system had established a legal precedent in which they only granted convictions under paragraph 175 if so-called intercourse-like acts could be proven. And so essentially this meant that lawyers and the prosecutors were forced to prove to the judge that penetrative sex had taken place between two men. And since most of these cases were levied against two consenting adults, simply even just one of them had to deny that it ever happened and the case would be thrown out. So as you can imagine, the Nazis felt that this legal precedent of proving intercourse-like acts was too limiting, to put too much of a limit on their power for their own cases. So in the summer of 1935, they write a new version. They amend paragraph 175, and you can see that new version here on your screen. The new wording talks about indecency, and the Nazi lawyers leave indecency, the definition of indecency, purposefully very vague. And this allowed prosecutors and judges to interpret indecent however they wanted to, with the ultimate aim of arresting as many men as possible. Right, and they also ramped up the punishment. So now a violation of paragraph 175 carried a prison sentence of up to 10 years. And what we see very quickly after this 1935 change is that prosecutors and judges really began to define indecency very liberally. And so it's not just intercourse that warrants a conviction, but also holding hands, kissing, or even, we have some cases, even just a lustful stare was enough to grant a conviction. And in fact, by the late 1930s and into the 1940s, there was one judge who went on record as stating that, quote, it's not necessary that physical contact takes place. It sufficed if homosexuality is even just intended. Okay, so now we even have this new legal precedent that says it's perfectly fine to grant a conviction, even if you think a person is just intending to do something gay or indecent, right? So now what this means is that essentially you don't need any evidence whatsoever to get a conviction for paragraph 175. Now, the summer of 1935, this is the same exact months that the Nazis are writing their famous Nuremberg race laws. And so this is, you can see this as a moment when the Nazis are trying to bring German law into line with Nazi ideology. And you can see that as they're writing the Nuremberg race laws and the new paragraph 175 at the same time, these two ideas of race and sexuality are tied together in Nazi, Nazi thinking. So they at the same time, they're defining citizenship now along racial and sexual lines. So as we pointed out earlier, right, the original version of paragraph 175 and the version that the Nazis wrote, neither one of those applied to women. They didn't apply to lesbians. And some Nazis did argue that lesbians should be criminalized, but ultimately they were in the minority. And the arguments for those, we have the records, ultimately were these. First, it was argued that women were just more publicly affectionate than men. So how could police decide which, in public, if women were holding hands, how could they tell if they were just being normal women or if they were, abnormal, supposedly, and a lesbian? But Joseph Meisinger, who was a really high-ranking Nazi, he became a leader in the fight against homosexuality. He doubted if lesbians even existed, right, or if lesbian desire even existed. So in 1937, he wrote that, and this is a quote, "If we are really to speak of lesbian activity, it is crucially important to ask what the object of mental images are when sexual behavior is taking place." So Meisinger, it seems, assumed that even when women had sex together, what they were actually imagining was having sex with a man. Right? And as proof of this, Meisinger pointed to the fact that objects that lesbians use during sex are often phallic in shape, like the, quote, ever popular candlestick. Right? So he's even trying, in his mind, he can't even comprehend that women loving each other even is a reality. But ultimately, the argument that there were two arguments that kept lesbians out of paragraph 175. The first was that women, whether they were gay or straight, stayed home in Nazi Germany, so they were less of a threat to the economy, the government, or the military. And the second, you have to remember, right, that fertility is the ultimate law in Nazi Germany. So we have these records of these Nazis sitting around a conference table talking about this, that unlike a gay man who had to be physically aroused enough in order to have sex, lesbians could still be impregnated, right? So we're impregnated even by force if necessary. And in 1942, so even by the end of the war, the justice minister of Germany at the time told his orderlies that unlike men, women are always prepared for sex. So lesbians were not subject to arrest or persecution under paragraph 175, but they did face other forms of persecution, right? As the Nazis destroyed the vibrant and dynamic societies that queer Germans had built for themselves during the Weimar Republic. And so while lesbians were not targeted as a group by this particular law, clearly their ability to live openly was shattered as they were expected to conform to the Nazi expectations of German motherhood and German womanhood. Now, we do have some cases of lesbians who were arrested and even imprisoned in concentration camps. So one example that you can see here is Henny Sherman, born in 1912. She was arrested and sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, which was the camp for women, in the early of 1940. Now, on the back of her admittance card, it's noted that she was both a licentious lesbian and a stateless Jew. Right. We know that, unfortunately, Henny Sherman did not survive the Holocaust. She was murdered in 1942 in Ravensbrück. But we, according to the research, can assume that she was murdered because she was a Jew, not necessarily because she was a lesbian. Now, in October of 1936, Himmler, who kind of took the fight against homosexuality kind of personally, establishes a central office for combating homosexuality and abortion in Berlin. So this is an attempt to centralize the Nazis' fight against homosexuality across Germany and across the Reich, right? And so you can see even by the name of this office what they thought, what Nazis thought the main threat to the master race was, because they're talking about homosexuality and abortion. It's the supposed threat against the birth rate, right? Now, one of the things that this central office did was rely on what were called pink lists. So these were lists of men who had either been arrested in the past for being gay, or honestly who were even suspected of being gay. And the Nazis didn't have to come up with these lists on their own. They essentially had to go to the local police office, and those local police offices had been collecting and building up these pink lists for decades, really since the beginning of the German state. So they would use these lists to be able to go and arrest and even blackmail gay men and force them to turn over further names of gay men. The Nazis were not above using entrapment. Sometimes they would send in plainclothes officers, into gay neighborhoods or in parks and cruising sites, so that they could try to, catch these men in the act, and then they would arrest them. Nazis and local newspapers often would publish the names and faces and addresses of men who had been arrested and convicted under paragraph 175. And so you can see from this one example here that there was often the rhetoric was framing that these men were endangering or a danger to Germany's youth. And so it was up to not only the state, but the local civilians to be able to help fight this threat. Now, here's a pretty frightening statistic. We know from the records that 1/3 of all cases that ended up in court were the result of civilian denunciations. So if you take Richard Gruna, for example, who we talked about at the beginning of this lecture, he was arrested at Christmas of 1934 because, we talked about how the Nazis had, their first step was to close down all gay spaces in Berlin. So of course there's no more public spaces. So the queer community essentially shifted to having parties and gatherings in their house. And so this is what Richard Gruna did. He hosted a series of holiday parties in the lead up to Christmas of 1934. But unfortunately, the festivities caught the unwanted attention of a neighbor. And the neighbor, saw these couples that were, two men or two women walking into this apartment. And she went and turned Richard in at a local Gestapo office. So the local Gestapo, within a couple of days, ended up arresting Richard, and Richard spent the next 11 years in different prisons and concentration camps throughout Germany. And unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. We know that actually that one denunciation from that neighbor that night led to the arrest of just over 70 individuals, people who had attended Richard's Christmas party that evening. So here you can see a quote from a guy named Friedrich Paul von Grotzheim, who was lucky. He did spend time in concentration camps, but he was lucky in the fact that he survived the Holocaust. And so he was interviewed in the late 1990s about his experience. And he gave this powerful quote that he said, "I must say that when it came to that," meaning homosexuality, "the majority of the population was clearly on the Nazi side." Now, denunciations became such a problem in Nazi Germany that we actually have newspaper articles from the late 1930s where local newspapers ran these articles asking their readers to stop overburdening the police forces by turning in so many men. And now I think that this stat and this fact is really telling, because we often like to think that it was simply the Nazis, this handful of bad apples, so to speak, these handful of evil Nazi guys who did all of this really horrible stuff during the Holocaust. But I think that this part of this history shows that political leaders can only take power and take action if a society gives it to them, right? And in the case of homosexuality, the wider society was all too happy to take part in this persecution by turning these men in. So after the 1935 revision of the law, the number of convictions for indecency among men skyrocketed. And in fact, the number of paragraph 175 convictions rose by an astounding 900% in the first 5 years of Nazi rule alone. Right. So in all, the records indicate that around 100,000 men were arrested in Germany between 1933 and 1945. And just over half of those, 53,000, almost 54,000, were ultimately convicted. Now, out of those 100,000 men arrested, somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 men were sent to concentration camps. And at first, I was struck by the major difference between those numbers, arresting 100,000 men and then 10,000 men being sent to concentration camps. And that's because, though, the men that the Nazis sent to concentration camps were those that they deemed repeat offenders. So these were men who had been arrested more than once and who were seen as a more dangerous threat by the Nazis, because this fear that they would end up corrupting more and more people into their supposed lifestyle. Now, once people were arrested and sent to concentration camps, through the processing, processing process, I guess, all prisoners were given a badge that denoted their reason for internment. And at first, in the first few years of the concentration camps, gay men were forced to wear many different badges. And so on some accounts, we have gay men talking about they had to wear a blue bar on their uniforms, which was also the same mark for so-called asocials. One man said that he had to wear a black triangle, which is another emblem for asocials. Some wore green triangles, which were those that were labeled for criminals, right? Because they had broken paragraph 175. So it depended on which officer was processing them at the time, how they were labeled. But by 1935, really the camp badge system became more standardized, and gay prisoners, as they were interned in the camps, were given a pink triangle to label them as gay. We do actually have a couple of accounts of survivors who suggested that the pink triangle was actually about 2 inches larger than the other triangles. And the idea is that it was so that camp guards would be able to identify a pink triangle from further away. Again, adding an extra layer of discrimination even within the concentration camp system. Now, the horrors that men with the pink triangle faced were similar to the horrors that all concentration camp prisoners faced. But as one might imagine, right, homophobia didn't stop at the barbed wire. Right? It followed these men into the concentration camp. So they faced discrimination not only from the SS guards themselves, but also from their fellow prisoners. We know from not only gay survivor testimony, but other straight survivor, concentration camp survivor testimony, that the men with the pink triangle were often given less food than their counterparts. They were often given harder work details. We know that at least in some camps, they were isolated in special gay barracks, again, so that they wanted to keep all the gay people together so they wouldn't seduce the other concentration camp prisoners. In many cases, the gay prisoners had to sleep with the lights on, with their hands above the blanket so that they wouldn't be tempted by themselves to masturbate. And so we know that even within this camp system, they faced a level of discrimination that other groups didn't necessarily have to. So here we have a quote from Heinz Hager, who was really the first gay concentration camp survivor to break the silence after the war and tell his story about what happened to him. And so he quoted that in the camps, we were to remain isolated as the damnedest of the damned. Now you have to remember back from earlier in the talk, the Nazis, again, didn't believe that being gay was something that was inborn or in one's constitution. And so their policy remained the eradication of homosexuality, not necessarily the annihilation of the homosexual men themselves. So this meant that their policy was to cure or re-educate these men and then reintegrate them back into society. So really the Nazis were a big proponent of conversion therapy, especially within the concentration camp. In fact, it was believed that hard labor in a prison or a concentration camp was meant to kind of reorient these gay men to make them kind of stronger, more manly, and therefore straight men. But after 1940, Himmler gave an order that allowed the local camp officials to mandate the gay prisoners have sex in a brothel, have sex with would bring a female prisoner and force them to have sex with these gay male prisoners as a way to try to teach them the joys of the other sex, right? And so if the gay men could prove that they were cured by their performance, if you will, they were allowed to leave the camp. And the SS officers, they judged this performance by actually like watching the couple through a hole in the wall. Now, for those men who couldn't so-called prove that they had been cured, a kind of a final option was open to them, that they could submit themselves to so-called voluntary castration. So the Nazis believed that, at the end of the day, if they couldn't force these men to change their behavior, they could take a more biological or physical approach to solving this problem. And we know that thousands of men did submit themselves to, again, the so-called voluntary castration so that they could be released from the concentration camps. Ultimately, gay prisoners were very rarely sent to gas chambers, right? Because again, they were considered first and foremost German, and there were efforts to try to reintegrate them and cure them, so they could go back and be German soldiers, German workers. And this is really different than the situation for folks like the Jews or the Roma or people with disabilities. They did not have that option to kind of be cured. They were slated for extermination and for genocide. But just because the official policy remained education, or re-education rather. That doesn't mean that there weren't systematic killings, sporadic killings of gay men, even in the concentration camp world, or even outside the barbed wire, because we do have some examples of individual Nazis who kind of tried to take the policy into their own hands, and really ended up killing a lot of gay men that way. Actually, in our archives, I was able to find, we started this lecture with the story of Richard Gruna. I was able to find his admittance card to Flossenburg. And so you can see here, right, his name, let me see if I can point it out with the mouse. His prisoner number was 2553, and you can see up at the top right corner, there's a paragraph 175 written there for the reason for his arrest. And as if that is kind of not clear enough, someone actually took the time to draw with a colored pencil a pink triangle and wrote this note up here, which means that he was so-called a now the English word is I'm completely blanking. But he was held in protective custody is essentially what it meant. And so fortunately for Richard, he was liberated at the end of the war, and so he was able to survive. But in this case, Richard is actually an exception to the rule, because out of those 10 to 15,000 men who were sent to concentration camps, over half of them, 65% of them, died in the concentration camps. And so in this case, Richard did survive, which was an exception. Now, to wrap up, upon the war's end, gay men in occupied Germany celebrated the defeat of the Nazi regime, and survivors hoped that paragraph 175 would finally be repealed and taken off the books. But these hopes would turn out to be futile, right? Men like Richard Gruna, who survived, would soon find out that while the war was over, their nightmare was not. Right? So the Allied authorities, right, the victors, allowed both East and West Germany to keep the Nazi version of paragraph 175. Right? The Allied militaries who, as they were liberating these concentration camps, when they came across gay prisoners, any of them that still had a time left on their sentence, the Allies transferred them from a concentration camp to a local prison, where they were forced to finish out their prison sentence. And time again, the West German court upheld the Nazi version of paragraph 175 and told the West German public that gay men were not victims of Nazi injustice, but instead they were criminals who had been constitutionally punished for breaking the law. In fact, there was a really big 1957 case in which the Federal Constitutional Court decided once and for all that the Nazi version of this law would be upheld because it was still necessary to protect the moral fortitude of the German people. So if you remember that graph that I showed you of the number of convictions of paragraph 175, if you extended that by 20 years, so the first 20 years of West Germany's existence, this is what it would look like, right? So you can see a vast drop after the end of the war, but after West Germany is established, it continues, it rises again, right? So at the end of the day, West Germany, right, this liberal democracy, ended up arresting 100,000 men under using a Nazi version of the law, right? So that's the same number of men that the Nazis arrested during the Third Reich. So all of this continuity after the defeat of the Third Reich allowed or caused one French gay survivor by the name of Pierre Ciel to state really powerfully at the end of the war that liberation was only for others. So this year, we marked the 75th anniversary of the defeat of the Nazis. And so it was indeed a moment of celebration. But I think it's important for us to take Ciel's words to heart. Was it a true liberation for everybody? Why did West Germany continue to use this Nazi law to prosecute men? And why did Germany only acknowledge gay men as victims in 2002? So that's a conversation for another day. But what we can do today is keep the stories of these men like Pierre, like Heinz, like Richard alive. By honoring their memory and the countless other LGBTQ victims, we liberate them from obscurity and we liberate them from oblivion. So we celebrate them and we continue to learn from them, knowing that history speaks to us for a reason, but we can only heed its warning if we're listening. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions now.
We have a few questions. Thank you for that wonderful, insightful presentation. One of the questions was, was it regular police who mainly arrested men under paragraph 75, or was it Gestapo that arrested as well?
That's a really great question, and it was a combination of the two, especially before the establishment of that central office in 1936. The Nazis really relied on local police forces, so regular police officers. But as the Gestapo grew, as the SS grew, and Himmler and his officials really kind of took over more of those duties as the power of the Nazi state grew.
When gay men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, was the decision made by a judge or by the police?
Oh, that's a yes. I should have mentioned that actually. So thanks for that question. Actually, the sentence in a concentration camp was not mentioned in the law whatsoever, right? So actually, this existed outside the boundaries of the German legal system. And so when a person was apprehended and sent to a concentration camp, this was at the order of the SS or the Gestapo. So these organizations that really only answered to Nazi leadership, like Himmler and Hitler. And so as I mentioned, these were normally men who had been arrested more than once or had multiple, were known to have multiple partners, because there was this idea that they were more of a threat. And so Himmler essentially believed in these cases, a normal prison sentence wasn't a harsh enough punishment to kind of cure them, right? To bring them back into a straight orientation. And so, yeah, no, that's a great point, that these concentration camp punishments existed outside the legal system.
What happened to Dr. Hirschfeld after the burning of all of his materials?
So fortunately, Hirschfeld was out of the country on a lecture tour at the time that his institute was raided. And so he was actually in France at the time, and he read about the developments in the newspaper. And he was quoted as saying that it was like reading about or watching his own funeral. And unfortunately, Hirschfeld, well, I guess fortunately for him, he never went back, but he did die of a heart attack in exile pretty shortly thereafter. And Hirschfeld was himself Jewish. He was socialist. He was gay. So he really checked. He was a major target for the Nazis for multiple reasons.
We have one final question. Do you see any parallels from then to today?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. And I would say, even if you're looking specifically at the members, right, the LGBT community or LGBT aspect of this history, there are some pretty striking lessons, like the fact that, a third of these men were turned in by their neighbors, that this wasn't just a top-down campaign. I think that itself, that gives us some really powerful lessons. But if you're talking about parallels and really the looking at the history of the Holocaust more broadly, and I'm guessing the question, was talking about parallels to today. It makes me think of that quote, right? I think it's from Mark Twain, that says, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes," right, or echoes. And I think there's a lot of rhyming, there's a lot of echoing happening right now between especially Germany in the 1930s and today. And I think that we ignore those echoes, we ignore that rhyming at our own risk. Because absolutely there are, I used to think, especially back in 2016, when Trump was elected, right? We got these questions a lot because he in his campaign he used a lot of divisive rhetoric and scapegoating of minorities. And I used to think, well, there are so many differences, and let's not be too quick to draw comparisons or draw parallels. But after these past 4 years, I think that we would be dangerously naive not to look at the parallels and the comparisons, right? So we have a group of people now with power who are claiming that our country was stolen, right, from them, and that it needs to be put back, hearkening back to some time when it was supposedly great, right? That it needs to be given back to its rightful rulers, so to speak. And if you look at Weimar and the United States, even today, I used to think, there are, of course, there's similarities, but there's important differences as well. Weimar democracy looked and functioned differently than American democracy does today, right? We have a pretty substantial system of checks and balances in place. But again, after watching what's happened over the past 4 years, where there are daily attacks on law and order, that system of checks and balances, the undermining of democratic institutions themselves, that's really scary to me. That's a scary parallel, right? We have, Trump, the president, standing at the White House, daily attacking the free press. Hitler also did that, right? He even had a term for it. It was the Lüge press, the lying press. This continued rhetoric of division and scapegoating. And even if we're looking at German history, people dismissed the early Nazis as, there was just a minority of the German public. Just like today, I think that no one would have seen the election of Trump coming because they said, oh, it's just a minority of people. They're not too much of a threat. But the Nazis only ever won 38% of the vote. They never, in a free election, they never had a majority. And so I think that shows a danger. And I'll just wrap up by saying that I read this by a scholar, and I'm blanking on the name now, but she used the phrase catastrophic gradualism, right? Because people living in Germany at that time never thought about themselves in history, or that ultimately the end was going to result in the Holocaust. Just like today, we're all living we're living our lives day to day, and we can't quite see sometimes how bad things have gotten. And we might tell ourselves, well, it's not bad as the Holocaust, right? There's no Auschwitz, there's no gas chambers. But my thoughts are, it doesn't have to be as bad as Auschwitz to be bad. And in fact, if we constantly compare, what's bad to gas chambers, we're going to constantly let ourselves off the hook. So I think, lessons from this history are the fact that democracies can die, right? They have died. They will die if they're not protected, right? We, as members of a democratic society, have to protect our democratic institutions. We have to build coalitions with each other. And if we want a society that upholds progressive, inclusive, equitable values, we have to build that ourselves.
Got 2 more questions in the comments real quick. With the parallels, do you see parallels between Chechnya and Nazi Germany as well? I guess Chechnya is not getting as much attention, but.
Yeah, and so I will say, just kind of as a disclaimer, I'm not as versed or familiar with the specifics of the politics that are happening right now. Of course, I know that the Chechnyan government is really cracking down on LGBTQ communities. There's even rumors of them rounding them up into detention centers. And so I think that absolutely there are parallels, because if you listen to the rhetoric, right, the way that the government speaks about their campaign against homosexuality, there's always this self-defense rhetoric that we're doing this to protect our youth, to protect our values, to protect our morals. And so it's never posed as, of course, no one wakes up and says we're going to be evil and arrest these people, but right, you have to pay attention and listen to the rhetoric of self-defense, because it's a cover for a lot of really nasty policies.
The last question is, could you recommend any books or documentaries to learn more about LGBTQ plus in the Holocaust?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, that's a good transition. I'm going to throw up this information. And if you go to my website, you can, I have a list, a tab called resources, and there's plenty of information about LGBTQ history before the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, and I've just added some more on the post-Holocaust situation for gay men and other queer people as well. We can add these links into the comment section below so that you have them even after we end the talk, but you'll be able to find plenty of resources there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and we enjoyed your presentation very much. So thank you very, very much for spending your time with us.
All right, thank you, Brandon. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Bye.